Good morning, happy Monday, or as I like to call it, Taco Tuesday Eve. This is Miss Farr from Cambridge High School at Milton, Georgia. Welcome back. Thanks you guys for who've been tuning in, and don't forget that we do have that Twitter account that's out there, and Mr. Horton is live on Twitter. So if you have any questions or anything like that, be sure to send those questions to him, and if there's anything that I can answer, he'll let me know, or if any shout outs I need to give, he'll let me know that as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So last week we finished up with period 5, kind of went through the whole thing with the Civil War, kind of moving into it. So now we're going to move into the next part, which is getting into period 6. So one of the questions I think I asked you guys was kind of leaving off was, what would the Compromise of 1877 mean for African Americans in the South? We talked about the end of Reconstruction after we went through the Civil War. We kind of talked about, the movement and what the radical Republicans were trying to do, how they were somewhat successful in some of the programs that they're doing. Of course, it did have some backlash from the South, and of course, they're circumventing those things after having to rewrite their state constitutions. And then also creating the Black codes to kind of go against that. So now that the election of 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes and the deal that the Democrats made in order to get him into office was the Compromise of 1877. So if this were a DBQ question, and you actually had this as one of your sources, I want you to take a few minutes and kind of look at what the cartoon is actually saying. Okay, so we're talking about what the Compromise of 1877 meant for African Americans in the South. All right, so here's what you see here. You see this is a Confederate soldier you see this is a Northern soldier on one side. You notice this, and this is also, I'll tell you, this is a Thomas Nast cartoon. Here on the north side here, and then over there, you see the person on the south. On the southern side, you can see here are former, newly freed Blacks or African Americans. In the background, you can see kind of buildings and basically all of the destruction that happened from the Civil War. You can see on this side the burning of several buildings and things like that. So of course you can kind of make the assumption that clearly this is the end of the end of Reconstruction. You'll notice that of course the South was decimated. They were really trying to rebuild themselves, and so this was kind of like the rebuilding phase of them trying to get back on their feet. All of the land that was destroyed, because as you know, the majority of the Civil War was pretty much fought inside of the southern states, and so they kind of had the most destruction. Here is Lady Liberty kind of bending her head over, and you'll notice that this is a grave. Inside of the grave, it has in memory of Union heroes in a useless war. So what is that saying? Basically they're kind of putting in the point that the war was useless, that there was no point in the war, that they should have kind of left things alone. Remember the southern states were kind of fighting to preserve their way of life, whereas the Union was trying to keep everything in the preservation. Another thing that you'll need to notice is the fact that you have a upside down flag. And usually when a flag is hung, when our American flag is hung upside down, that means despair. So kind of a nation in despair. And then also too, you'll look at the Southern flag and you'll notice that the Confederate flag is actually flown right side up. So still kind of basically saying that the Compromise of 1877 meant for African Americans in the South, it pretty much meant that everything that the African Americans had gained up until this point more than likely is probably going to go back. It's going to be taken away from them. That the rise of several vigilante groups like KKK and the White Citizens Council, all those different things are going to kind of come about. And of course, it's going to mean the removal of the Union soldiers from the southern states so that they can kind of go back and put things back the way they were. All right, so let's go for a lesson overview. And before we get started, we want to say a good shout out to Miss Vera from Oswego East High School and also Miss Pippa from Wayne Memorial High School. All right, so we're going to talk about industry, technology, and the New South. So what does that mean when we say the New South? Again, under that whole the radical Reconstruction plan, the Union was kind of already together. They had already put something into place for the southern states to come back. But of course, now that this has changed, they're going to call themselves the New South and kind of talk about those factors that contributed to that from 1877 to 1898. We're also going to look at technological advances that are going to happen. We're going to look at socioeconomic continuities and changes that affected. We're going to talk about industrial growth and capitalism, not just in the South, but also pretty much in the United States, period. We're going to look at some cultural and economic factors as we talk about migration patterns, because we still have influx of immigrants that are actually coming into the United States during this time. And then we're also going to look at the increased economic opportunities and the effects that it had. So continuing on along with the skills of contextualization, sourcing and citation, making those connection and claims and evidences. So basically just really continuing on, looking at some things and then still kind of working on those DBQ skills. So what do you need to know? Well, there are 5 major things you need to know about period 6. First of all, we're looking at large-scale industrialization and advances in technology, which gave rise to capitalism in the era of big business. So we're going to notice some names of some capitalists. They're going to call themselves captains of industry. Other people will refer to them as robber barons. If you're on Twitter Universe, kind of tweet Mr. Horton some of the names of the robber barons that you can remember during period 6, when we're kind of going into what will be known as the Gilded Age. Second thing is, due to the rise of big business, many groups such as farmers and unions call for stronger governmental protection to regulate the economy and safeguard the rights of workers. We're going to see the start of the rise of more factory, more industry. We're going to see the people who are leaving the rural areas and kind of going more into influx into the cities in order to find jobs. So the factories are going to get much bigger, but the working conditions are going to worsen as time goes along. Which kind of goes into 3, migration increase both to and within the United States. So when we're saying to the United States, meaning that we have people who are leaving their countries and coming into the United States looking for better opportunities. That whole idea of finding, the United States was going to be the land of opportunity. And then, of course, as that influx comes in, the cities are going to grow. We're going to start to see areas that are going to be overcrowded. You're going to start to see unsanitary conditions that are going to be kind of brought to the forefront during this time, which then will lead us into number 4, a new intellectual and cultural movements that arose that are going to be known as the Gilded Age. And we're going to kind of talk about what does the term Gilded Age actually mean. And kind of think along that little saying about all that glitters is not necessarily gold. And then, of course, the last one is debates intensified over citizens' rights, especially in relation to gender and race. So there is some more continuities. There's still the continuation of fighting for women's rights. And then also to African Americans are going to find that even if they move for other economic opportunities in other areas, it may not be the same. All right, so let's jump into and kind of talk about the New South. When we say the New South, we're kind of talking about post-Reconstruction. We're kind of talking about how the Southern economy is going to go from an agrarian, having a lot of plantations, to now kind of having to embrace the Industrial Revolution, or what we like to refer to as like the Second Industrial Revolution. What we call the term or the phrase New South was dubbed in 1874 by Henry W. Grady, who kind of talked about the fact that we need to kind of move away from that, go away from the agrarian society. We no longer have the labor force, we no longer have slavery. A lot of our crops were destroyed thanks to the Civil War. So now it's time for us to modernize and to really kind of put more factories down. So more factories, more mines, and more mills. And so you're going to start to see a lot of those areas that were once, plentiful with plantations that are now going to find factories being built. And also mills. So now the workforce is going to have to kind of turn to a trade or a skill that they may not have known before, but they're going to actually have to learn in order for them to be able to survive. So you will have like textile mills and you will have tobacco factories that will emerge, but the plans for the New South are not going to be as successful as it will be for the North, mainly because they didn't really have necessarily a lot of the population. A lot of the people had abandoned the South, especially after the Civil War, because A, they didn't have enough money and they found themselves bankrupt, so they went to the North in order to seek new opportunities. B, a lot of African Americans, those that did remain there, kind of had to figure out. So they're going to kind of end up in another system of kind of what I like to call legalized slavery. And we'll talk about that, known as sharecropping. And then C, some people just went out west because of the fact that, the gold rush had happened in the 1850s, the late 1840s, 1850s. So many of them kind of saw economic opportunities out that way. And also the fact that they can, under the Homesteaders Act, you can have those opportunities to go out, settle, and kind of build land from there. So it basically guesstimated that by 1900, the per capita income in the South was about 40% less than the national average. So in other words, there was a lot of poverty in the so-called New South. So what they had hoped to do at the end of Reconstruction was to bring the South back to its former glory. But of course, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they no longer had that labor force that they had before. So let's talk about the actual labor force that they did have. It was referred to as legalized slavery because it's not that they were forced into this system, but for many former slaves, they only knew the agrarian way of life. They only knew farming. Very limited, very minimal of them, not limited, but very minimal of them knew how to do a trade like blacksmith or, they knew how to do those types of things. And those who did know those trades were often sent to the north to work. So they had to kind of go back to what they knew what was best, which was actually farming. And so the system is known as sharecropping or tenant farming. And so pretty much all the land that was sold off, it was bought. Now, there were some Southerners who still managed to keep their money. They kind of cooperated with the Northerners, and they were known as scalawags. That was kind of the nickname that they were given. And so they basically sold off parcels of land. And so it's basically like they rented their land and allowed the people to work the land to grow crops on there for a percentage. Now, it always came with the price. So the sharecropping and tenant farming were systems in which white landlords, often former plantation slave owners, entered into these contracts with impoverished farm laborers for their lands. And it wasn't just African Americans, it was also even former, it could have been former plantation owners as well. So anybody who was considered to be poor and displaced, they might have found themselves into sharecropping or the tenant farming. So here's how it works. You work the land, you shared a portion of your crops with the landlord as payment for renting the land. So it may be a 70-30, where it's the landlord might get 70 and the person who's sharecropping or renting will only get 30%. And of course, under the sharecropping system, it was pretty much made so that you were pretty much always indebted to the landowner because you didn't have supplies, so you didn't have the crops, you didn't have the seeds to grow the crops, so that was part of the credit that they gave you. You also needed the equipment. You also need equipment to, to sow, to cultivate. So all of that was pretty much given to you on credit with you kind of paying that person back. So the system was pretty much geared to always keep the person in debt. It was basically the same thing, but they found themselves again. They found themselves back in a system in which they couldn't possibly work themselves out of. And so the arrangements actually benefited the landowner. It never benefited the actual person who was kind of the sharecropper. And so this system pretty much left both Black and white tenant farmers living in dire poverty. And so pretty much because of that, and no one had money to spend because it was kind of a system of credits. Like, the credit was up here, the debt ceiling was up here. So they never actually managed to get the debt ceiling down. It left the Southern economy stagnated. So that was one of the reasons why the New South system never really worked out the way they hoped it would, especially even when they brought in the mills and the factories. All right, so were there some successes in the New South? Yes, there was. You did have the formation of iron and steel manufacturing. In Birmingham, Alabama is going to be one of those places that's going to happen. There is going to be a new process that's going to be made by Henry Bessemer. It's called the Bessemer process, where he figures out a way to reproduce steel at a massive rate. And so Birmingham, Alabama, and that's actually my hometown where I was born, is going to prosper from iron and steel manufacturing, as well as mining and furniture production. So they are going to kind of become what Atlanta was prior to the Civil War, kind of like at the forefront. Also they talked about things like new cigarette rolling machines that, to feed the growing market of tobacco. That was, and then you're going to end up finding the American Tobacco Company inside of North Carolina. The biggest thing for the South that's really going to benefit them is going to be the textile mills. So that's going to kind of be one of the successes that they will have inside of the New South. Also, if you'll look at that last bullet point, kind of talking about the early 1880s with Northern capitalists kind of investing inside of textile mills, especially like around the Appalachian Mountains, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. They really are going to kind of put a lot of factories there, mainly because they knew that a lot of Southerners didn't possess some of the same skills that the Northern factory workers did. So they realized that they can get the same work, teach them those things, and also pay them less. And so you're going to kind of notice that even though they're doing this in the New South, this is actually going to be a common trend throughout the Gilded Age, where they're going to take unskilled workers, pretty much anybody who came within the United States, who came from foreign countries, are probably going to end up, came from a farming life. They're going to put them in the factories, teach them how to do the job. But again, they're unskilled laborers, so they don't have to pay them as much as you would somebody who was very highly skilled or who was trained at it. So don't think about it as this was just something that happened in the New South. It actually happened pretty much all over the United States during the Gilded Age. Other things that came about in the New South in order to circumvent. Remember, we talked about the fact that the Southern states had to accept the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Well, one of the ways that they circumvented that at first was the Black Codes, but then the Black Codes will later be transformed into what are called Jim Crow laws. And so Jim Crow laws basically were created by white Southerners to enforce racial segregation. And it pretty much will last all the way up until the 1960s and a little bit still into the 1970s when you kind of think about it. Under this system, basically, they had facilities or certain things that were designated as whites only or colored. They had signs that pretty much were proliferated around the southern states. It could be anywhere: water fountains, restrooms, bus waiting areas, movie theaters, swimming pools, any type of public facility where there was a possibility that both Blacks and whites might actually be in the same place at the same time. Pretty much there were going to be signs, and Jim Crow system was put into place. If you tried to challenge segregation back then, you could face arrest or any type of violent reprisal, because if you recall, the KKK was still very dominant in the southern states, and so they pretty much used those scare tactics in order to kind of force them back into submission. Probably one of the biggest court cases that really kind of showed how the federal government viewed segregation is going to be the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically the quote that comes from that, or the quote that comes from that is the whole separate but equal. Under this law, Homer Plessy was a individual who boarded a train and sat in a car, I guess he sat in a section that was designated as whites only. Now, he considered himself to be only a quarter Black, or I think like a quarter Black or something like that. And so his argument was that because he was not 100% Black, he should be allowed to sit in the car that he was in. And of course, they said no. So when he actually sued under the 14th Amendment rights. And so that was how the case kind of got a little bit misconstrued, because they said the 14th Amendment is protecting gay African Americans civil liberties, and you're saying that you're not 100% African American. So you pretty much is basically kind of saying that he needed to make up his mind. If he is going to say that he is Black, then he needed to say he was Black, but that was the only way that he was going to be able to use the 14th Amendment as his defense. But because he said that he wasn't 100% Black, and he said that he was only a quarter, they kind of threw that whole 14th Amendment out. And so therefore the whole separate but equal accommodation was basically ruled as it being legal. And of course, Plessy versus Ferguson will be overturned by what future court case? So that's a question for Twitterverse to see who can get that question. What future court case will overturn Plessy versus Ferguson? And we already talked about that before, but I just want to see if you guys can remember. All right, so while I'm waiting on that question, we're going to watch a quick video.
By 1877, Reconstruction had succumbed to bitter opposition and backroom politics. Federal troops then occupying the South were withdrawn, and white supremacists were left to reestablish the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war. Across the former Confederacy, informal practices of racial discrimination were written into law. States instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other requirements that disenfranchised Negroes. They passed Jim Crow laws, which imposed segregation and other restrictions on blacks. A few blacks challenged the system of legal discrimination. In New Orleans, a man named Homer Plessy deliberately defied the Louisiana state law requiring separate rail cars for blacks and whites. He was arrested and jailed. But the incident led eventually to the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy argued that the law infringed on his 14th Amendment right to equal protection. But the majority of justices disagreed. The court's opinion read in part,
legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
The court affirmed that segregation was constitutional as long as accommodations were separate but equal. It also left it up to the individual states, not the federal government, to guarantee equal standards. As the lone dissenting opinion, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote,
the thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done.
Plessy versus Ferguson became a landmark decision. It sanctioned a system of institutionalized racism that would persist for decades, one that would require a second period of Reconstruction to overcome.
All right, congratulations to Talia Wilcox for getting the correct answer. If you didn't know what court case will overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, it will be Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. And so as the video kind of stated, the Supreme Court did basically say that, segregation was legal as long as the accommodations were separate but equal. And of course, as you will find out, when we kind of went through the civil rights movement, especially from the 50s and the 60s, that was not the case. And there was also the civil rights movement that will happen also around this time as well. So let's jump right into the next part of this, which is known as the Gilded Age. And again, this is kind of happening concurrently while the southern states are still kind of rebuilding themselves and still kind of reaffirming themselves as the New South. Big things about the Gilded Age: it was an industrial age from 1870 to 1900. And it was an era of industrialization. So this is the part of the industrialization and technological advances of the lesson that we're going to talk about. What was happening during the Gilded Age, or what was growing? The growth of the railroad system. Of course, the biggest project that was happening with the Transcontinental Railroad was also going to happen during this time. The steel industry is going to boom up. You have the oil industry, which is going to be dominant, both in pretty much with the Gilded Age. One of the things you need to understand is that businessmen pretty much ran not just the economy, but also politics. So what you're going to kind of have to think about it is that at least 80% of the nation's wealth was controlled by 10% of the population. There was a very small group of people who pretty much controlled politics. And this is probably one of the more difficult ages for students to study, because most of the time when you think about historical things that happened throughout history, there's usually like a president or someone that you can associate it with. But with the Gilded Age, the role of the presidency is going to change. It's not going to be seen as a person, but more so as just a title. And the person can be controlled by the political parties, and the political parties were controlled by corrupt individuals, which then kind of gives you the era that it was known as the era of political corruption. The government pretty much had what was called a laissez-faire, which means to let alone. The French term means to let alone. They were very favorable to big businesses, and that had a lot to do with kickbacks and, things that were given, kind of bribes that were given to certain politicians in order for them to get certain things done. The politicians, of course, used their positions for personal gain, hence the kickbacks. And then the term gilded means anything that has been overlaid with gold or silver in order to give it appearance of it being more beautiful or more valuable than it actually is. And anything that appears to be something that it is not. So remember that little phrase I gave you, that all that glitters is not gold? That is pretty much going to be associated with the Gilded Age. All right, so before we kind of get into the response to the Gilded Age, very quickly, let me give a shout out to Miss Dolliman's class at Minola High School, Kevin Stores at Shadow Mountain High School in Phoenix, Mr. Hagar from his student Jeremiah. And also another question for those of you on Twitterverse: can you tell me what famous author came up with the phrase the Gilded Age? Like, this was coined from a famous author. Let's talk about the responses, because even though the Gilded Age was something that happened pretty much nationwide, each area had a different response to that. So for the North, the Gilded Age meant industries, industries that arose near natural resources. So they're going to pretty much put their things, factories near, water systems, that kind of thing, especially with they mentioned the steamboat, and really kind of facilitate that better. You're going to have the growth of major cities. Pittsburgh is going to be known as the steel city. Chicago is going to be known as the meat packing city. New York, which had already been big during that time, is going to find itself being more dominant because as an influx of immigrants are coming into the United States, New York is going to be one of those places. Ellis Island is going to be their stop. You're also going to find that industrial cities were jam-packed with immigrants, and they're going to live in ethnic enclaves that are going to be similar to those neighborhoods that they had for the countries in which they came from. So you're going to see like a melting pot is really, really going to happen. In the West, big cattle ranchers and farmers. Farmers are really going to be struggling out West because they're going to find their land pretty much being taken away from them thanks to the growth of railroads kind of coming out and taking land and acquiring that land. You also have the idea of mechanized farming, things like the mechanical reaper. So of course, you're going to have an overproduction of food and an underconsumption of buyers. Because of that, with overproduction and underconsumption, farm prices are going to fall. And then, of course, in order to ship those items to get them to markets, railroads are going to start charging astronomical prices. Some of them are going to kind of do it from depending on state to state. And because there was no interstate commerce that was protecting that, farmers are going to find themselves kind of going into debt. And unfortunately, the family farms are going to find themselves going under. Many of them are going to find themselves being foreclosed on as a result of this. And then thinking about the South, especially after the Compromise of 1877, there was no army there that was there to protect, those people who were trying to make the best of the situation under Reconstruction. There was no one there to continue on the work with the Freedmen's Bureau in order to educate newly Blacks, in order to get them to vote. So they considered it to be open season on African Americans, meant that many of them are going to some of them are going to stay there, but many of them are going to actually end up leaving because of that. So it's going to be a period known as the Great Migration. The 14th and 15th Amendments are virtually going to be ignored. And again, that's going to be because of Black codes and then eventually Jim Crow. Segregation is going to be huge during that time, and then citizenship, and then enfranchisement. And so they're going to start putting various levels into place or layers into place in order to prevent the acquired rights that African Americans had gotten. They're going to kind of use that to kind of take that away from them, but do it in a legal way so that it doesn't appear as though they're not actually upholding those amendments. All right, so let's do a little bit of exam practice. So here's a question for you guys. The question is, this is a DBQ question actually, and I'm going to give you just one document. It says to analyze the impact of both late 19th century international migration to the United States and internal migration within the United States. So remember, we talked about people moving for the push and pull factors, people who are coming in from different countries. So take a few minutes and read this. This is from Josiah Strong, and it's called The Dangers of Cities. Okay, so what is this person saying? If you're saying analyze the impact of the late 19th century international migration to the United States and internal migration. All right, so first of all, he is focusing in on, if you had to talk about it, he's focusing in on international migration. He hasn't mentioned that much about internal. So this will be one of those DBQ, this will be one of those documents that you would put under that paragraph or that category for international migration. So his point of view is the fact that cities are basically terrible places, that, once the cities that found themselves having a entire population that was only like maybe 9% foreign, now find themselves 23% or more. And he's kind of talking about the evils in which immigration is coming back. kind of talking about the fact that, because the cities are so largely foreign, that they're bringing with them liquor, that they're bringing with them corrupt, that as more and more immigrants are coming in, that means that poverty levels are also increasing as well. He kind of talks about the fact that it's just kind of like when he says social dynamite, he's basically saying that it's a fuse that's about to be lit. And eventually what's going to happen is that everything is going to explode once you have all of these corrupt individuals living in this one city. So in a sense, what he's saying is that because of the influx of foreigners that are coming into these cities and are settling there, that he's kind of bringing along the idea of nativism. And so nativism is something that is if you had to address either like a change or a continuity, this is something that's continuing on, where you're going to start to see a lot of people who are saying that they do not want to have people from of foreign descent moving into the United States and taking jobs away from other individuals that they feel are qualified for it. And so, he kind of talks about the fact that, the Germans made up 39.3%. He talks about how the Irish made up about 45.8%. So he's really kind of focusing in on those particular groups and kind of talking about not only are they coming here, but he says Romanism. And so when you think about ancient Rome, you kind of think about, the fact that they were considered to be, I can't think of the word, it's slipping my mind right now, but just, seriously, just the over sexualization, the crime, it's just going to be anarchy in a sense. And so that social dynamite that he's talking about is just, it's only a matter of time before all of this is going to like blow up in it, the city's face, and it's going to pretty much kind of cause self-destruction. So if you were looking at that from this person and what he's trying to say, he's basically kind of arguing against. And if you were kind of thinking about the intended audience, he was probably kind of looking at the fact that he's trying to come up with ways to kind of force the federal government to come up with laws to limit the amount of immigrants that are coming into the United States during that time. All right, so as the Gilded Age starts, we're going to talk about the rise of capitalism, and this is going to be huge. So the United States went from, pretty much a nation that was half and half. You did have, some factories, and, of course, the majority of the nation is going to be farmers, but during that time, that's all going to dwindle. So during that time, we're going to go from a nation of farmers to a nation of factory workers. The work itself is going to kind of create large corporations. It's going to kind of implement what they call techniques that were increasing efficiency and profit, but it also kind of increased danger. It was more so about the profit and efficiency, but they did not take into consideration the individuals that were working for them. So for them, it's going to have poor working condition, long hours, and pretty much what you found factory workers were working between 12 and 14-hour days with only one day off during the week. And families are going to find themselves that they had to, not only were the parents having to work, but they had pretty much every individual working, including children, once they reach a certain age. So a lot of children had to stop going to school after a certain age and had to go work in those factories in order to help their family live. So you're going to start to see this increasing gap between the rich and the poor. And what you're going to find out during the Gilded Age is that there's also going to be that, the wealth of the nation is going to be made off of the backs of the working class. And so this is going to be pretty evident when you talk about the rise of capitalism. And then, of course, one of the biggest contributing factors was technology. So as the nation was advancing, which was great, capitalism grew, and that meant that those who were getting rich and profiting off of this are going to continue to get richer while keeping that working class at its level and kind of making sure that they didn't rise above that level. And so when they consider this as the Gilded Age, they also kind of think about this as an era of innovation as well. So technological innovations, you heard me say this before, how this was a second industrial revolution. Other things that, were coming about, they looked at methods and ways of making shipping more easily and accessible. Communication is really going to kind of grow up. The telegraph is going to become big, and eventually, we'll have the telephone. You're looking at business transactions, things, how they use during the second industrial revolution. It was more so about using chemicals and chemistry and things in order to produce materials that didn't exist before. Ways in order to utilize coal, steel, in order to manipulate those and to make those into other things like, buildings and skyscrapers and railroads. You begin to realize that by the year 1870, there are more people who are working for other people than they were actually working for themselves. So when it says it's gone away from the age of farmers into big business, this is what they're saying. So more people are starting to work for other people or working for large corporations instead of working for themselves. And then, of course, people were actually moving into cities. And so, of course, the American economic system is going to develop out of this. And of course, living in cities, of course, came with the cost. And so the cost of living is going to go up. And so a lot of those rural towns are going to find themselves being abandoned as more and more people are flocking to the cities because they need those jobs. And so it's really, really kind of important to know that thanks to a lot of those technological innovations, like the telephone, like the light bulb, a lot of these things made it possible for these businesses to grow, but at what cost? And so a lot of other inventions that you kind of contribute to the Gilded Age, you have international train travel. And what that means is that being able to travel across the United States. Before, when the trains were used, it wasn't really used to move people. It was more so used to use products. But now that's going to mean that people can move from location to location. The invention of the telephone, refrigeration for meat. So it was no longer needed to salt meat in order to have it hold. And that was going to be very important, especially for the things out west with the cattle, getting that type of beef over to the from the west over into the East Coast. Also things like, you think about your dairy states like your Wisconsin's and those areas having to get those products out because they were very limited as far as how far they can ship those products. Now they're actually making it so that it's easily accessible to other areas within the United States. Then, of course, I talked to you guys about the Bessemer process for producing steel. And then another big thing that's going to happen, especially as the railroad systems grew, is standardization of time. So time zones are actually going to be invented during this time. So, right now I'm in the Eastern time zone. And then, of course, you have Central, which is 1 hour after me. And then 2 hours will be Mountain. And then 3 hours will be Pacific. And all of that was thanks to the railroads and them traveling and noticing that the position of the sun was changing as they went, either from east to west and then coming back from west to east. All right, so what would be the impact? Excuse me. Steel and electricity, although it was not invented during that time, it did kind of cause a widespread for people to kind of start doing to do a lot of inventions. So pretty much when once it was actually invented during the and then the Gilded Age allowed them to actually manipulate those things and to create different products and different uses from that. Technologies made the ability for them to produce things faster. It allowed them to produce things with a lot less skilled workers. So you remember how I told you guys that before they had highly skilled workers, they had to pay them for their abilities. Now they can actually just get random people who were coming in. So a lot of the immigrants that were coming in found themselves kind of working in those factory systems, and they were unskilled, and the working conditions were horrible, horrendous. They can get injured on the job, and they found themselves to be easily replaceable. It also kind of talks about the fact that, again, I kind of mentioned this before, more days and longer hours. And so for those who were at the top of the chain of innovation, they felt great. They invented something, now it could be used. They were being paid for it. They can get patents for it. They can profit off of it. They can have those big businesses. So they call themselves captains of industry because they saw a need for something and they were able to, and they created something that everybody else need. Whereas the working class, the impact of innovation kind of did more harm than good. And of course, it kind of took the fact that the idea of the family, of the mother being at home and raising the children, that was going to become less and less limited, especially for those who are living in the cities. They're going to find themselves kind of breaking away from that because, again, everybody in the household had to be able to contribute in order for the cost of living to be affordable. All right, so let's do a little guided practice. So take a few minutes and look at this political cartoon and kind of think about the idea of what they're showing you here. And really quickly, let me give a shout out to Ms. Sullivan from Canada Callaway High School of Arts in Delaware, Mr. Singh from Cherry Creek High School, and Ms. McGinnis at Kamawasagi. If I give her a shout out, apparently she's going to donate food to her students. So I hope you guys get whatever food, sandwiches, etc., from your teacher, Ms. McGinnis. And thank you for your support. Okay, so if you, again, kind of talking about the impact of innovation and kind of looking at this, this is a child. So of course, you kind of guesstimate that she can be anywhere between 6 and 7 years old. So a young lady, so she's no longer in school. So that's number one. She is working in a textile factory, more than likely looks like a cotton factory where they're spooling, just kind of looking on the ground. Notice how small she is. So why would a lot of these places employ children? Because they're small, their hands can fit in little small areas. They can work children for longer hours. And they can fit into under those little crawl spaces. And so again, you kind of can talk about the impact of, the Gilded Age and innovation and what it would have, especially for children. Number one, the lack of education, because education had to stop at a certain level because a lot of children found themselves working in the factories. Harsh working conditions. Sometimes children were mistreated. They were beaten or whipped if they didn't work hours. They were made to stand longer hours. And again, they were paid much, much less, especially much less than the men, but also much less than the women. And then you can kind of see this young lady, she's not even wearing any shoes. She's just kind of wearing socks. So that's a hazard within itself. So it's not only just a safety hazard, but I mean, again, this young lady should be in school. She should be learning, she should be playing. However, because of the need for people to work, and probably, you can't ascertain whether or not she lives in the city or not. But most of the time, because of the fact that, like I said, the cost of living had went up with the innovation that happened during this time, she has been taken from school and now she has to be placed inside of a factory system. So a major impact when you kind of look at this political cartoon. That photograph. And you will have photographs, on that could possibly appear on your DBQ. So don't just think of political cartoons or passages or charts. Sometimes they will put photographs up there. And if you happen to get a DBQ from the Gilded Age or something about progressivism, more than likely you will get a lot of photographs, because that was how we learned about the horrors of the Gilded Age, because of, some of the pictures that were taken during that time. So let's do a little check for understanding. So very quickly read this passage here. This is a excerpt from the Up From Slavery, an autobiography from Booker T. Washington. And this was his Atlanta Exposition address in 1885. So. Okay, so just give you a little bit of background. This is a very controversial, I guess not really a speech, even though his tone was very, very meek and mild. The reason why it was controversial was because during the Atlanta Exposition, they were really kind of not sure exactly what this individual was going to say. This was an exhibition that was actually supposed to be whites only. And then you had this individual named Booker T. Washington who asked to make a speech. And they were kind of wondering, was he going to try to speak out against segregation? So one of the things that he kind of advocated for the foundation, what he's talking about when he says to cast down your bucket where you are, is kind of talking about not demanding your rights, or not to try to demand your civil rights. And basically, in order for you to prove yourself, you need to work hard. And he basically said that for a Black person, they needed to work hard during that time. And once they show their worth and their value, then they will slowly be accepted into society, and then segregation will basically end. So he's kind of talking about the evils of segregation and ways to fight ways to fight segregation. And his opinion was to work hard and show yourself to be of value. That way, those jobs that are given to immigrants will therefore be given to African Americans who should have had those jobs in the first place, because of the fact that they probably were more familiar with those jobs than, say, a person who was coming over from a different country. So the question is, the author of the quote above was most likely motivated by what? Opportunities in the New South. So kind of laying that foundation down for you and kind of letting you understand where Booker T. Washington was coming from and why he would say that, kind of, be meek about it, and work hard, and working hard will always prove itself. Then that's the way to kind of do it. So let's do a debrief and summary. And I want to give a quick shout out. J.C. Altman wants me to give a shout out to Kevin Story at Shadow Mountain High School in Phoenix. It's his first year. He was a mentor for him, and this is his first year teaching APUSH. So just kind of going back through everything that we talked about. looking at industry technology in the New South, and basically just kind of talking about the beginnings of the Gilded Age. We kind of talked about, looked at some point of view when we looked at some of the political cartoons, and also looked at some historical situation when we kind of looked at the photograph of the young lady that was inside of the factory. And then, of course, kind of talking about looking at the socio continuities and changes, kind of talking about how, things kind of remain the same for the North. Industry was kind of growing, but of course, changes are really going to happen in the South and also out West. Kind of talking about increased economic opportunities and its effects, about how it kind of depleted some of the rural areas as more and more people kind of migrated up north, but of course the overpopulation of cities. And then of course you also have the ideas that you have more immigrants that are kind of coming into, and Mr. Horton will kind of take over that, kind of talk to you about the impact of immigration as it happens during that time. So let's do a little AP exam practice. So same question that we had before, this time kind of looking at the impact of international migration versus internal migration. So take a few minutes and read this. Okay, so this is from a female, kind of talking about the Whole House Girl. And if you knew anything about some background about the Whole House and Jane Addams, this was kind of a temporary housing for people who kind of came into the United States. They could either be, mostly it was foreign immigrants or women who came over and they were single. And so they stayed in the Whole House so that they can actually gain work in order to be able to afford to live and find themselves a place to live. And so again, kind of talking about migration. Could this be used for, to say, international or internal migration? Because of the fact that she mostly kind of talks about, the dangers, the pollution from the water, from the sewers and things like that. She kind of talks about the fact of the population, but she doesn't really mention where the population is actually coming from. So you could maybe ascertain that you could possibly use this for internal migration, kind of talking about people moving within cities. But also too, what you're really going to have to think about with this, with the Whole House, is kind of think about historical context. So when you're looking at this and kind of thinking about it, not necessarily looking at the point of view of this, but I would use this more so for, I would do this for a historical context, kind of thinking about the big picture, really kind of thinking about the impact, the meaning, what was happening, why did Jane Addams create the Whole House, what was kind of going on, because this is kind of the age of what is known as progressivism. So they're kind of fixing the situations that happened from the Gilded Age. And as a result, the Whole House is going to be one of those things. And of course, she talks about how the Whole House made the day's work bearable. That it was an oasis in a desert of disease and monotony, kind of talking about the fact that typhoid fever had happened. So you could definitely probably say you can use this for eternal migration, but if you're going to analyze this, I would definitely go for the context part of this, because of the fact that you can't really you can kind of ascertain the fact that the point of view of this is that there's overcrowdedness in the cities and there's dangers and there's also pollution, but also too, you got to think about the bigger picture of what would lead to this. And it's not just the fact of the pipes and kind of talking about the pipes, causing pollution within the water. But of course, the pipes are coming from where? Those factory systems are dumping all of this, all their sludge from those factories into the water. And of course, there's no clear, there's no way of, kind of doing that, no filtration system that's happening as of yet. All right. So one of the things before we finish up for today is you guys will have the ability to have some access to some resources. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through this very quickly. And then remember that this is being recorded. So if you need to kind of go back, you're able to do this. So everyone should have an AP College Board account. So one of the ways that you can kind of get access to some practice questions is, first thing you're going to do is log in at myap.collegeboard.org. If you do not know your password or your username, you need to contact College Board directly so they can go ahead and reset that information for you. Your teacher or your school will not be able to get that information for you. You will have to go directly to the College Board. Once you're in there, you're going to be inside of where your AP classrooms are. So if this is your site here, you're going to click on right here where it says access to your AP classroom. So depending on how many AP classes you take, you'll go into the AP classroom for that particular course. From there, you can have access to a lot of resources. So once you click into this, like you see on this screen, the program we're having is for AP Bio. So if you wanted to look at the YouTube live classes or optional practice, you can look at that. And if you want to look at to practice answering free response questions, you can go here. So you do not actually have to wait for your teacher to actually assign these things. These are things that you can kind of go in and take a look at and kind of see to get this information yourself. So this is your optional student practice. All right. From there, one of the things your teachers can actually I'll take that back. I think your teachers do actually have to kind of go in and actually assign these, but you'll see like here for this one, they have a Unit 5 FRQ and it tells you the practice that they can do. So here are all the units and everything. Your teacher can go in and open them up for you and make sure that it says opened. If it's locked, that means you are unable to access that information. So when you want to go in and start practicing that, you will click here on the continue button so that you can kind of go ahead and access that assignment. And that helps you start or begin the question. From here, you will read and they will be AP exam type questions. And this is really, really good exam practice because at the bottom, you will actually enter your response as you would for your AP exam. So you will read it, you will look at your stimuli to see what is going on, and you will type in your answer. So the question says, describe the three structural components of RNA nucleotide monomer and explain the role of RNA polymerase during transcription. I apologize if I mispronounced that. I am not a biologist. So they will answer those questions and enter their response. And then right there, you'll click submit. So what happens after you click submit? It'll ask you, are you sure you want to submit your response? You say yes or no. If you think there's something that you forgot to add, you click no, go back and check. If you're sure, you click yes. And then what will happen is it will give you this that says they will actually show you how this will actually be scored on the AP exam. So you'll actually get immediate feedback of letting you know whether or not you're writing enough, if you're writing too much. And again, it's you also have the ability to review it, and then you can actually revise your response. So you know, you can say yes, review it before you actually submit it, and it'll give you the feedback of what you need to add into it. And if you decide no, I think I'm good, you just hit no and hit submit now. Here is basically, it kind of shows you like some of the scoring guidelines that'll kind of tell you what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. It'll give you some examples of what your response should, and of course, how to earn those maximum points. So we think that this is a very valuable tool that you guys could use. And then of course, once you kind of go back and actually revise your response, you can go back and review it again. And then you can hit submit after you get that review done. So make sure before you hit submit now and that you actually go and allow it to review, just so you can make sure that you're going along the right path to earn those points that you need to earn. And so that is just something that is there for you guys to be available. Your teachers can actually access that information as well and assign those things for you. So the biggest thing is remember that these are all resources in addition to these videos that we're doing. And so the last thing I'm going to leave you with for tomorrow, you'll be with Mr. Horton. I'll be back with you guys on Thursday. Is how did industrialization impact different groups of Americans? So kind of think about that. Think about everything we've talked about, the impact, technology, et cetera, and then think about how it will impact different groups of Americans. And before I leave, we wanted to make sure that I give a shout out to Mr. Chavalas from Maturin High and also Miss Kathleen Hall from West Hill High School. According to her students, you've been doing a ton to help your students out. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and we hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Have a great day.